In majors level biology, you're required to write some full lab reports. And by full lab reports, we mean you're going to have a purpose and an introduction, you're going to write a hypothesis and a prediction, you'll write up your experiment in the methods, do a results section, analyze your data, and then interpret it in the discussion or the conclusion. You'll also be required to look up articles and other scientific reports and present those data or those findings in several sections of your lab report. Now, the lab report will be graded using a rubric, and in each one of these sections, for example, the introduction and the method, there's common things that you need to do and criteria that you need to meet. There's also some really common mistakes that are made. So I'm going to go over these, as the purpose of this video is to talk about writing a lab report, what you need to put in each section, and some common mistakes that you can avoid making. So the first place you want to go to get resources is going to be on D2L. And in D2L, there's a section on the side in the content section called Lab Resources. And in the Lab Resources, you're going to find a video on the scientific method, and you'll find the rubric for lab reports, you'll find a sample lab report. So you find lots of resources in there and also in your workbook. This is the contents page for your workbook. You will find resources in here, a lab on the scientific method and writing lab reports. There is lots of information in there about different sections of your lab report. This is the experiment you did where you tested dexterity and temperature. There's another worksheet here talking about collecting and reporting data that goes over things like best ways of presenting information, because when you're writing your lab report, it's about communicating effectively. What happened? What did you do? What findings did you make? How does that compare with other studies? And so it is important that you present your data in a way that best communicates the story of the experiment. In the appendix of your workbook, you'll find 3 really important resources that you should definitely read and be familiar with. The first one is Lab Report Guidelines for Students, and that outlines the information I'm going to talk about, which is how to write each section and what should be in each section. And then a sample lab report, an example of what I think is a really good lab report. Your lab report might be slightly different, but it gives you a good idea of the level of detail, the length of each section, how the section should be worded, the tone, and things like that. So just starting off with some general requirements for a lab report and some things you can keep in mind as you're going through. You must type your lab report, and lab reports are going to be run through a program called Turnitin, so you must make sure that the work is your own, written in your own words and paraphrased and cited correctly. You need to draw any graphs and tables on the computer in a program like Excel or Word, so no hand-drawn graphs. You need to write in the third person, so no I or we. Sometimes in a hypothesis you can write I hypothesize or I predict, and that's okay. But in methods, it's best to write in the third person and always in the past tense, and we'll talk about methods in a bit. Don't put names in there. Change it to sample 1, sample 2, etc. Make sure you have your title, name, your section, and then include the names of anyone you worked with. And then the sections should have little headers, so like the section of the introduction, the methods. You don't necessarily need little headers inside there, for example, hypothesis, but you can if you want. Write in full sentences and keep in mind that grammar and spelling is important. Don't mix up information from different sections. And by that, what I mean is to put parts of the discussion into the results section or your methods into your introduction. Keep the results separate from the discussion, keep the methods section separate from the introduction, etc. If you did the same procedure over and over again within the same experiment, you can just outline that procedure in detail, and then you can then say, and this was repeated so many times. Always present the raw data, and by the raw data I mean the data that you collected in the experiment, and then you want to analyze that data and try and find a way to present the summary and the overall message of that data. So what is the average? What is a good graph? Don't force a graph out of something, but graphs are a really good way of summarizing data. So present the raw data, but also present some kind of summary which you'll use to draw your conclusion. Let's use the sample lab report to go over what needs to be in each section. The title summarizes what the experiment is. I've got my name, I'm going to put my class or section, and then I've got my lab partners. The first section of your lab report is going to be the introduction. The point of the introduction is several things. First, you're going to prepare the reader to understand your experiment and why you are doing it. I've included a purpose early on to outline my experiment and tell the reader, what am I hoping to achieve? What question am I trying to answer? It's going to outline what we already know about the subject. So normally when we do a scientific experiment, we're trying to fill some kind of knowledge gap. That's not always going to be the case when you are doing scientific experiments. However, you need to outline the information that we already know and, importantly, inform your hypothesis. What is the reason that you think this is the answer to the experimental question? And the way it's going to do that is by using information from other studies. And you'll see here I have citations from other studies. And this is quite heavily cited, which is a great thing. I'm using APA format where I have the authors and a comma and then the year. Now, there are resources on D2L on how to cite and paraphrase. Let's look at the rubric section that is going to grade the introduction. So in order to get an A, or 4 points out of 4 for the introduction, you need to do all of these things. You need a purpose. Explain why the experimental question is important to answer. Why do we want to know, for example, if dexterity is affected by temperature? Why is that important to know? Think about different professions. Think about different reasons where a negative impact on dexterity would be a bad thing, or a positive impact on dexterity would be a good thing. You need enough background information for the reader to understand the topic. Don't assume that your reader is very knowledgeable about the topic. Now, you don't need to go into a huge amount of detail, but you need to give enough information so they are able to understand the topic. Include the findings, so the conclusions of numerous studies. And by studies, we mean peer-reviewed scientific articles. A really good place to find those is on Google Scholar, and there are resources on D2L in the lab section about how to find sources and how to get the information from them. So you need information from past studies to explain your hypothesis, and that is a key thing. Why do you think this is the answer to the question? And you're going to briefly introduce the study. In this experiment, we're going to blah, blah, blah. Notice these lower scores, some things are missing. So be aware of these and critically analyze your introduction to make sure you've checked off all of these things. Now, at the end of the introduction, you'll see this section. And this section is basically informing your hypothesis. So it's always a good idea to have something in here. And I'll let you pause the video and read this in your own time. You'll see it's talking about why do we think this is the answer to our question. So the hypothesis is going to have to include several things. It needs to include, what do you think is the informed answer to the experimental preference? Do dogs prefer meat or dry food? We're going to say they have a preference for raw meat, so that's our answer to our question. And the reason why is because dogs evolved to eat meat. Notice how I do not have any experimental results in here. I'm not linking this to how I am going to test this question. So it's very general. Again, let's go back to the rubric and make sure that we've done everything that we need to do in our hypothesis. So the hypothesis is based on research and sound reasoning, and that information is introduced in the introduction. So your introduction is going to basically inform the reader why your hypothesis makes sense. It's an informed answer. Again, you're going to use scientific research. There's a scientific basis. There's a reason why you think this is the answer, and that reason makes sense. We're not going to confuse the hypothesis with the prediction, meaning you don't have any expected results. No information about how you're actually going to test this question. It's a general, I think the answer is this for this reason. Your prediction is where you state what you think you are going to see in your actual experiment if your hypothesis is true. Now, there are many ways of testing the same hypothesis. Make your prediction match the methods. So the methods are going to give dogs some bowls of food, beef flavored kibble, and then some raw beef. And you're going to give the dog some time to eat the food. And then the results that you're going to collect are going to be weight of the food remaining. So this is the data or the results that you want to present in your prediction. So your prediction is going to talk about amount eaten. You could also word your prediction where you said there will be more weight of meat flavored kibble left in the bowl or less weight of raw meat left in the bowl after the experiment, as long as it's linked to the experiment. Now, other ways of testing this, you could show dogs, I don't know, some kibble and some raw meat and measure how much saliva they make. Which bowl do they go to first? So that's what I mean about there being several ways of testing the same hypothesis, the same experimental question. Do dogs prefer raw meat or meat flavored kibble? You think they're going to prefer raw meat. How are you going to show that in an experiment? This is one way of doing it, and therefore these are the results you're going to see from this method of testing that question. So to score high marks on your prediction needs to be linked to your hypothesis, and it needs to state the actual results if the hypothesis is true. So in our experiment, we hypothesized that because dogs evolved or were selectively bred from wolves, and wolves have a meat-based diet, and the evolutionary history of dogs is that they ate raw meat, we're going to think they're going to eat raw meat compared to dry kibble. They're going to prefer raw meat. And our way of testing that was to give some dogs raw meat, dry kibble, and see how much of it they ate. And so that's what our predictions are going to talk about. They're going to talk about amount eaten. And you can phrase that in different ways, but those are the results. We're not going to talk about which bowl did they go to first, how many times did they wag their tail when they were eating the raw meat versus the kibble, etc. And don't confuse your predictions and your hypotheses. And again, here are some things that can be missed, and you'll score lower marks on your prediction. Okay, onto the materials and methods. So how did you collect the data that you're going to present in your study? And that is what I want you to keep in mind when you're writing your methods. The primary reason for writing the methods is to show the reader how did you get the results that you're presenting. If you write your methods in enough detail, someone else can replicate your methods, and that is one requirement of your methods. However, it's not the main reason for writing your methods. So for that reason, your methods must be in the past tense. We did this, or this was done. It's not a list of instructions like do this, then do that. And that is one common mistake that I always see in the methods. So first we're going to list our materials. And notice I'm giving weights and giving details. If you're giving measurement, give the units. If you're giving some kind of vessel like a beaker or bowl, say how large it is, because someone, again, they needs to be able to replicate this experiment. I've given the brand of food because that could affect the results. If someone did this experiment again and they used a different brand of food, maybe the dog will show a preference for that brand of food instead of raw meat. Whether in this case, maybe they're going to prefer the raw meat over this brand of dog food. I'm then going to outline this experiment in the past tense. It was performed, past tense. I'm going to give the date, I'm going to give where it was performed. I'm going to give lots of details without going into so much detail that it gets annoying. So someone can do this experiment again. How many dogs did I use? What age were the dogs? Think about what in your methods could influence the results. The breed of dog, the type of dog, the size of the dog could influence our results, and therefore we want to include those details, whether the dog was hungry or not. So make sure you include all of the details that shows that you did this experiment in a way that's going to produce reliable results. Now, if you didn't do something that you think you could have, and therefore it may have affected your results, you can talk about that in the discussion. So methods, they're going to be clear. It's going to be step by step and in order. What did you do? When did you do it? So someone else can repeat it. It's very clear what was done. Very important that we write it in the past tense because it's what you did, and don't interchange your tenses. Now, I think best methods don't have I or we, and it's more like this was done, the dog was given this. And give reasons for your methods if appropriate. So for example, If you removed a dog from the study, why did you do that? Why did you use a particular type of material or instrument over something else if it's appropriate? And then list all of your materials, and it's nice to give a nice list at the beginning, but you can also include it within the description of your methods. So I've done my experiment, now I need to present my results, and I'm going to present the raw data, meaning all the data from the experiment, and then I'm going to summarize it. And a really great way to summarize is with figures, and we're going to refer to those figures in the text of our results. Notice how any numbers under 10 are written out in full. And then here's a nice summary. Across all the dogs, over twice as much kibble was eaten than raw meat. So find some way of summarizing your data, and here's a figure that I'm going to refer to. So if I go down, here are my figures, and to keep in mind when you're doing your figures, you need things like units, you need titles of your axes, you need graphs to make sense visually, have your axes scaled appropriately, have the colors be appropriate. Don't use something like, if you're doing temperature, don't use a red color for a cold temperature and then like a blue for like a warm temperature. And at the bottom I've got a little bit of a summary. So that's figure 1, and then if I go up down here I've got figure 2, and this is my summary. So as I said earlier, don't force graphs out of things. Sometimes a graph won't work, but graphs are really good for summarizing, especially when you've got quite a lot of data and telling the overall story. Very important, I am not going to explain what my results mean. I am purely stating in this case, there's more raw meat left than dried kibble. I don't then explain what that means. That's for the discussion. So I'm going to record my results in a clear way. I'm going to show all of the data collected, and then I'm going to show some kind of summary statistics. That could be a graph. I could write the mean in the text, think about what's going to communicate it better. I'm going to analyze my data and organize it so I can see the trend. The reader can see what the trend is. What do dogs prefer? And then I'm going to make sure I use units, labels, especially when I'm talking about things like tables and graphs. Now on to my discussion. There's several reasons for it. You're going to give the overall finding. At the beginning, you repeat the purpose of the experiment just to remind your reader what you were doing and why. Repeat your hypothesis. And here's a nice summary of the experiment. Overall, dogs ate more kibble than raw meat. So I'm summarizing just my entire results. And then I'm going to say what the results mean. This suggests that dogs prefer kibble to raw meat. The hypothesis that dogs will prefer raw meat to kibble and the prediction that dogs will consume more raw meat than kibble when given both foods was rejected. So we don't say it was wrong, we just didn't prove our hypothesis. The results suggest opposite. And really very, very important to keep in mind, it is perfectly fine to reject your hypothesis. What you should never ever do is go back and change your hypothesis to match your results. And it's very obvious when that happens, because then your introduction is not matching your hypothesis. You're going to be saying, I think this is going to happen. And then your hypothesis will be like, well, actually, I think something else is going to happen. And that doesn't make sense. So the next bit is I'm now going to explain my results, whether it be the results I expected or not. And if I didn't get the results I expected, which is in this case, I'm going to try and find a scientific reason for it. And then I also want to look at my methods and make sure that I was actually testing what I thought I was testing and my results were robust because my methods were robust. So here we've got some results of some studies that are going to explain my data that basically is the opposite. Dogs prefer kibble. So this is where I'm comparing with other studies. That's one thing you need to do as well. These authors here reported that dogs prefer fresh meat to cereal-based foods. This is a difference in our finding, maybe due to our methods. Maybe we didn't identify the true preferences of dogs. Maybe the dogs didn't represent typical dogs. Maybe they were raised on kibble, etc., etc. And then I'm going to have some kind of conclusion at the end, which kind of summarizes the whole thing. Again, it's perfectly fine to disprove your hypothesis. Now I want to include my references, and I'm going to cite in APA and give the full citation. There are resources on D2L about how to do this. Make use of Google Scholar. So the remainder of the rubric for the discussion, I want to make sure I either reject or accept my hypothesis based on my results. I say whether I made the correct prediction or not. Remember, it's totally fine to not make the right prediction as long as your hypothesis and prediction are based on science. I want to summarize my data, and I want to use my findings, my data, to draw conclusions. And I'm not going to make any huge leaps. Importantly, I'm not going to be like, this is the answer, the end. Maybe my methods weren't that great. I'm going to compare the findings. So what did other studies find of several other studies? And I'm going to compare my results with those. It's clear whether I found the same thing as other people generally or not. I'm going to find some kind of biological reason for my results, whether it's what I expected or not. And then I'm going to critique my methods. Maybe I thought our methods were just totally awesome. Fine, I'll be like, I don't think there are any issues with our methods. I can make improvements or suggestions for improvements, and that may be further studies, or it may be, if I was to do this again, this is what we would do. Again, trying to avoid using words like I and we. You would say, if the study was to be repeated, this is one further modification that could be made, or a further experimental question that could be answered. So the last part here, you need to follow instructions. Were you asked to report all of the results, or summarize the class results, or just your own results? Are there any errors? Presentation, spelling, and grammar is really important. You need to well format your report. You need to present it professionally. You don't want any spelling, grammar, or formatting errors. And then citing and referencing. Really important here, it also includes paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is writing in your own words. What you can't do is copy and paste chunks of text and then just change a few words here and there. And there are resources on D2L on how to make sure that you're correctly citing and paraphrasing. You need to make sure that you are definitely doing that, because otherwise you run the risk of plagiarism, and that is not a good thing. So cite your sources and make sure that you paraphrase correctly.